In June 1978 in Bath, Ohio, the life of 18-year-old Stephen Mark Hicks would be tragically cut short. Stephen was hitchhiking to a rock concert when he was picked up by a young Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer invited Hicks back to his family home for a beer, but when Hicks tried to leave, a dark impulse took over. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, then strangled him, making Stephen his first known victim. The body was dismembered and the remains scattered in the woods behind the house, staying hidden for over a decade. It wasn't until Dahmer's 1991 arrest that he finally confessed, giving the Hicks family the closure they had sought for 13 years. We remember Stephen Mark Hicks, a life stolen but never forgotten. May he rest in peace. In the shadow of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, the 1987 disappearance of Stephen Tuomi stands as a chilling turning point in his dark history. Stephen Tuomi, a 25-year-old cook, met Dahmer at a Milwaukee bar on November 20th. They eventually went to the Ambassador Hotel together. It was in a room at the Ambassador that the tragedy occurred. Dahmer later claimed to have blacked out, waking to find Tuomi had been beaten to death. Desperate to hide the crime, Dahmer purchased a large suitcase and transported Tuomi's remains to his grandmother's house in West Allis. In the basement of his grandmother's home, Dahmer dismembered the body. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, no remains were ever found. Tuomi was reported missing by his family, but with no evidence or witnesses, the investigation went cold for nearly 4 years. The truth only surfaced after Dahmer's 1991 arrest. He confessed to the murder, though he was never officially charged due to the lack of remains. Tuomi's death is seen by many as the moment Dahmer's compulsions escalated, ending a long hiatus and leading to his most active period. Today, we remember Stephen Tuomi as a young man whose life was tragically cut short. His story remains a somber part of Milwaukee's history. By understanding these tragedies, we honor the victims and remain vigilant in our pursuit of justice. Thank you for watching. In January 1988, a tragic encounter in Milwaukee marked a dark chapter in criminal history involving Jeffrey Dahmer and 14-year-old Jamie Dockstader. Dahmer lured Jamie to his apartment with the promise of money for posing for photographs, a deceptive tactic he used to gain the young boy's trust. Once inside, the situation turned violent. Dahmer overpowered Jamie, ending his life and making him the second victim in Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment. Dahmer dismembered the body and discarded the remains in the building's trash, ensuring Jamie's fate remained a mystery for years. The truth only emerged after Dahmer's 1991 arrest, when he coldly detailed the events to investigators, finally bringing a horrific closure to the search. Today, we remember Jamie Dockstader not just as a name in a file, but as a young person who deserved safety, dignity, and a future. This story serves as a grim reminder of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable among us. Thank you for watching. In the spring of 1988, the city of Milwaukee was unknowingly in the grip of a monster. Among the many lives stolen was that of 22-year-old Richard Guerrero. Richard was described by his family as a devoted son, who often took his mother shopping and ran errands for her. He was born on December 12, 1965. On the evening of March 24, 1988, Richard left his family's home to visit a friend. He never arrived, leaving with only $3 in his pocket. That night, it is believed he crossed paths with Jeffrey Dahmer outside a local establishment known as the Phoenix. This encounter would be his last. Dahmer approached the young man, offering him $50 to spend the night with him. Richard, unaware of the danger, accepted the offer. They traveled to Dahmer's grandmother's residence in West Allis. It was here, in a house meant to be a sanctuary, that the tragedy unfolded. Once inside, Dahmer drugged Richard using sleeping pills. The young man was rendered unconscious, completely at the mercy of his captor. Dahmer then strangled Richard with a leather strap. In a series of horrific acts, he performed oral sex on the corpse before dismembering the body. In a chilling effort to hide his crimes, Dahmer dissolved the remains in acid and pulverized the skull. No physical remains of Richard Guerrero were ever found. For months, Richard's parents, Pablo and Irene, lived in a state of agonizing uncertainty. They even hired a private investigator to find their son. The search yielded no leads. Richard was one of 4 victims whose bodies would never be recovered, leaving his family with no grave to visit. The year 1988 marked a significant escalation in Dahmer's crimes. He soon moved into his own apartment, where his spree continued unchecked. Later that year, Dahmer was arrested for assaulting a 13-year-old boy. Despite this, he was only sentenced to probation, allowing him to kill again. Tragically, the brother of the boy Dahmer assaulted in 1988, Konarak Synthasamphone, would become a victim 3 years later in a notorious incident. In May 1991, police actually returned a disoriented Konarak to Dahmer's apartment, failing to recognize the danger despite the strange odors. The nightmare finally ended in July 1991, when Tracy Edwards escaped Dahmer's apartment and alerted the police. The search of the apartment uncovered horrific evidence that shocked the world. Dahmer eventually confessed to the murders of 17 men and boys. In February 1992, he was convicted of 16 counts of murder and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years. Dahmer's life ended in prison on November 28, 1994, when he was killed by a fellow inmate. While the world focused on the monster, the family of Richard Guerrero remained focused on their loss. His father described Dahmer as the devil himself. Richard's sister, Janie, never stopped seeking information about her brother's remains. The lack of physical closure remains a deep wound for the family. The story of Richard Guerrero is a somber reminder of the vulnerabilities exploited by evil and the critical need for systemic vigilance. He is not just a statistic, but a son, a brother, and a life stolen too soon. In June 1990, the city of Milwaukee saw a chilling escalation in the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. Edward Warren Smith, a 27-year-old acquaintance known as Eddie, would become one of Dahmer's victims. On June 14th, Dahmer invited Eddie to his apartment, where he was drugged and tragically strangled. In a horrific attempt to hide the crime, Dahmer used acid to dissolve the remains, destroying the skull. No remains were ever found, leaving Eddie's family with agonizing questions that lasted for years. The truth only emerged in 1991, when Dahmer's arrest revealed the full extent of his depravity. Today we remember Eddie Smith not as a statistic, but as a person whose life was cut far too short. Ensuring the victims are never forgotten is a lesson in our shared history. Ernest Miller was a gifted 23-year-old dancer from Chicago with a bright future ahead of him. In September 1990, while visiting family in Milwaukee, he was lured by Jeffrey Dahmer to his apartment. Inside apartment 213, Dahmer incapacitated and then tragically murdered Ernest, a gifted soul lost too soon. Dahmer's horrific acts included dismembering the body and preserving Miller's skeleton as a souvenir. The truth was only revealed in 1991 when investigators found the remains of 11 victims in Dahmer's home. Dahmer was convicted for the murder of Ernest Miller and 15 others, receiving multiple life sentences. Miller's family spoke of the profound pain of his loss, remembering him as a loving and talented young man. We honor Ernest Miller's memory, ensuring he is remembered for his life and dreams, not just his end. Thank you for joining us in honoring his memory. Justice was served, but the loss remains. On September 24, 1990, David Courtney Thomas, a 22-year-old father, was lured to his death in Milwaukee. Met by Jeffrey Dahmer at the Grand Avenue Mall, David was promised money to pose for photographs. At Dahmer's apartment, David was drugged and strangled. His remains were never recovered. His disappearance remained a mystery until July 1991, when police discovered Polaroids of the crime. David's sister Valerie identified him from those photos. He remains one of 4 unrecovered victims. David Thomas was a beloved son and father. His family continues to seek peace after this tragedy. A story of a life taken too soon. May he rest in peace. In the dark history of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes, the story of 17-year-old Curtis Durrell Straughter remains a profound tragedy. Curtis was a vivacious young man and a student at the Milwaukee High School of the Arts, with dreams of becoming a model. On February 18, 1991, Dahmer encountered Curtis at a bus stop and lured him back to his apartment with the promise of money for photos. Once inside, Dahmer drugged Curtis, handcuffed him, and then strangled the teenager to death with a leather strap. Dahmer dismembered the body, keeping Curtis's skull, hands, and genitals as trophies to keep him company. The horrific truth was only discovered months later, leading to Dahmer's arrest and the recovery of evidence, including Polaroids of Curtis. Dahmer was found sane and sentenced to multiple life terms. Curtis's mother, Dorothy, bravely faced him in court to voice her grief. Today, Curtis is remembered for the life he lived and the potential he held, forever a reminder of the preciousness of every soul. April 1991. Milwaukee was a city unaware of the darkness unfolding within one of its apartment complexes. On April 7th, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay would become the subject of one of Jeffrey Dahmer's most horrific experiments. Lindsay was lured to Dahmer's apartment under the guise of a photo shoot, a tactic Dahmer used to ensnare his victims. Once inside, Dahmer drugged Lindsay and began a cruel attempt to create a submissive companion through a horrific drilling procedure. Dahmer injected acid into his victim's skull, seeking to induce a permanent state of docility in what he called a zombie experiment. The experiment failed. When Lindsay began to wake, Dahmer strangled him, ending the young man's life and keeping his skull as a trophy. Today, we remember Errol Lindsay as a young man with a life ahead of him, whose story remains a somber chapter in history. Errol Lindsay, 1972 to 1991, a name carried forward with respect and remembrance. On May 24, 1991, the life of Tony Anthony Hughes was tragically cut short by Jeffrey Dahmer in a case that still resonates today. Tony was 31 years old, a deaf black man, and an aspiring model known for his kind spirit and his expert use of sign language to communicate his dreams. He met Dahmer at Club 219. Lured to Dahmer's apartment for a photo shoot, the two communicated that night through handwritten notes. Inside the apartment, Dahmer drugged Tony and performed a horrific experiment with hydrochloric acid before ultimately strangling him. Tony's body remained there for days. 2 months later, investigators found Tony's remains. His mother, Shirley Hughes, later delivered a powerful testimony, signing "I love you" to her lost son. Tony was more than a victim. He was a beloved son and a dreamer. We remember him today for the light he brought into the world. May 27, 1991, a night that exposed a catastrophic failure in justice and cost a 14-year-old boy his life. Konarak Synthesom phone had escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, drugged and bleeding. He was found wandering the streets by concerned neighbors. When police arrived, Dahmer lied, claiming the boy was his 19-year-old adult lover. Despite Konarak's obvious trauma, the officers believed the killer. Fueled by homophobia and racism, the officers ignored the pleas of witnesses who insisted Konarak was a child in danger. The police literally handed Konarak back to his murderer. 30 minutes later, Dahmer took his life. The officers involved were later fired but reinstated, leaving a legacy of deep distrust and a call for accountability. We remember Konarak as a child who was failed by the system. His story remains a tragic reminder of the need for empathy and justice. In the dark history of Jeffrey Dahmer, the story of Matt Turner remains one of the most tragic chapters of the summer of 1991. On June 30th, after the Chicago Pride Parade, 20-year-old Matt Turner met Dahmer, who lured him back to Milwaukee. Inside the Oxford apartments, Dahmer drugged and strangled Turner, making him one of the last victims of his spree. The truth only emerged weeks later, when police entered apartment 213 and uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Investigators found Turner's remains throughout the apartment, his head and organs in the freezer, and his torso in a storage drum. Dahmer was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, bringing a grim measure of justice to the families of his victims. Today, we remember Matthew Turner, a young man whose life was cut short, but whose story we tell so he is never forgotten. Among the 17 victims of Jeffrey Dahmer was 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger, a young man with a bright future stolen far too soon. In July 1991, Jeremiah met Dahmer at Carol's Speakeasy in Chicago and agreed to spend a weekend with him in Milwaukee. By July 5th, when Jeremiah wanted to return home, Dahmer began a horrific attempt to create a permanent submissive companion. Dahmer performed a gruesome procedure, injecting boiling water into Jeremiah's skull. Jeremiah slipped into a coma and died 2 days later. Jeremiah's remains were later discovered in the apartment after Dahmer's arrest on July 22nd, ending the terrifying spree. Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms, while Jeremiah's family sought justice through a civil rights lawsuit. The case brought intense scrutiny to systemic failures in law enforcement and the treatment of marginalized communities. We remember Jeremiah Weinberger not just for his tragic end, but as a life that mattered. May his story serve as a call for justice. In July 1991, Milwaukee was shaken by the final crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer, including the tragic death of Oliver Lacey. Oliver Lacey was a 23-year-old aspiring bodybuilder and a devoted father, known for his kind and amiable spirit. Dahmer lured him to his apartment under the guise of a photo shoot, a deception that led to Lacey's untimely death. Lacey was one of the last victims found when police finally uncovered the horrors hidden within Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer's confession and subsequent trial brought a grim closure to a case that forever changed the city of Milwaukee. Today, we remember Oliver for his life and the family he loved, ensuring his story is never forgotten. May we continue to seek justice and remember the humanity behind every tragic story. In July 1991, the horrific spree of Jeffrey Dahmer came to a chilling end with his final victim. Joseph Arthur Bradehoft, a 25-year-old father of 3, had traveled to Milwaukee seeking a fresh start. On July 19th, Joseph was lured to Dahmer's apartment with an offer of money for photographs. Inside apartment 213, Joseph was drugged and strangled, becoming the 17th victim. His remains were discovered days later, stored in a drum and refrigerator in Dahmer's home. The capture of Dahmer on July 22nd finally stopped the monster and ended the nightmare. Dahmer was found sane and sentenced to life, but his life ended in prison 3 years later. For the families, the scars remain, but the memory of Joseph lives on in his children. We remember Joseph Bradehoft, a life tragically cut short just as it was beginning anew. May we never forget the victims of this dark chapter in history.